On today's On the Other Hand, we talk with someone working across lines of division in the community. Here's a sneak preview.
It seems like the idea that diverse viewpoints have become divisive viewpoints.
This is On the Other Hand. A podcast sponsored by Bravery Angels in Arkansas, where we explore politics and other issues of importance to Arkansans through conversations with community leaders. Stay with us today as we talk to another leader in Arkansas who works across differences to get things done and to bring us closer together. Hello and welcome to On the Other Hand. I'm your host, Glen White, here with my co-host, April Chatham Carpenter. As I'm sure you know, on our podcast, April and I interview community leaders in Arkansas who help work towards solutions across various political and other divides, or in some other way reach across divisions within our community. So, April, tell us who our guest is today.
Well, Glenn, I'm very excited to have somebody that I've known here since 2015, since I've been at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and Joni's been here for over 30 years, I think. Joni, you can tell us more about that. But Joni is the Vice Chancellor for University Affairs and the Chief Government Relations Officer, and we get the privilege of talking to her a couple of weeks before she is going into retirement. Now, by the time this is published, it might be she may already be in retirement. But welcome, Joni, to our podcast. We're excited to have you here.
Thank you, April and Glenn. Glad to be here.
So as we get started, I'd like to just kind of ask you a general question. You obviously work in the political realm, and I have no idea. I've never heard your story about how you got started in politics and your interest there.
I would be glad to tell you that story. And I have to go back to childhood basically to begin the story because I was always a bookworm and a history nerd. And my dad also was one. And so he drug us on family vacations all around. If there was a historic marker anywhere within a 5-mile radius or so, we got to go visit those things. And that sort of morphed into me for me just to become a student of American history and government. And that really led to my choosing political science as my degree in college. And I grew up in Hot Springs. I specifically came to UA Little Rock because I knew opportunities to work in the political realm would probably be more prevalent here in the capital city. And so I chose the school a lot because of the opportunities for internships and things that I knew I would be able to do. So ultimately, when I graduated, UALR at that time had a office at the state capitol working on legislative policy research with legislators and committees, and I was fortunate to be a student intern in that. So that became my job after I graduated. I really fell in love with the policy research that impacted legislative changes. And I did that for a while. And eventually we were asked, my colleagues and I that were working in that area were asked to stand up the government relations structure that UA Little Rock has today. Back then, most campuses didn't have staff on board that just did that exclusively. So I was able to help put that together and have been working in that area ever since. And it's just become a labor of love over time. My journey has been really having an appreciation for our government system, and especially the men and women that have committed their lives to careers in that. And so that really sort of drives me every day to still be part of that work.
Well, we'll talk a lot about that and probably relationships that you've developed as we get into the interview. But for our listeners and for me actually as well, I'd love to know, you talked about a government relations officer. I don't know what that person does typically.
Sure.
What does a person that has that title do?
Right. And more globally, we talk about terms like lobbyist and liaison. Those are sort of some of the terms that you may hear in higher education, and especially in Arkansas. Government relations professionals usually work between levels of government. So for myself, I work on all three: federal, state, and local areas of government in Little Rock and Arkansas. And so we work with the officials at agencies agencies and elected officials' offices on issues that are important to the university. We're looking for resources a lot of the time to help fund the university's work in various areas. We also troubleshoot a lot. So if there are legislators or officials who have concerns about things that are happening at the university or problems that are occurring, we sort of are the folks who have to ferret that out and see what that looks like and try to address that to maintain, the relationship. And at the end of the day, that's what it is about, is building and keeping and maintaining and nurturing the relationships that we need at the government level to help make sure that the university's issues are heard.
Okay, it sounds like an interesting fit for someone interested in this kind of work and politics, and you're interested in it coming up all the way from your dad taking to history museums. Sounds like set you up really well. So, in all of the work that you've done in this capacity, these capacities over the last years at the university, I bet that there are some success stories that you're particularly proud of. And I'd love to hear you talk about one of those.
Sure, I would love to. If I could actually talk about two
That's great.
quickly, if I can. So as I said, I work at all three levels of government, and at the federal level, we really didn't have a federal sort of strategy about 15 years or so ago. And we started really getting serious about that work and trying to go find resources and connections at the federal level with the agencies and with our congressional offices on places where we knew UA Little Rock could deliver research or service or other things that could really help with various national issues or priorities. And really the first one we started working with heavily was our Nanotechnology Center. And both at the state and federal level, we worked to create the funding for that center. And at the beginning, we were going and talking to people at the Department of Defense and saying, we think we can create bone. We think our Nanotechnology Center can grow bone. That would be useful when you have soldiers who have lost limbs or have had injuries in their service, and that our research could help to find ways to alleviate that problem. At the beginning, we were sort of promising we could do that, but today we know we can. In fact, the Nano Center has spun out a company now that works on that, and so we are growing bone in a lab at the university that's being used by the U.S. military, and that's so rewarding to see that sort of work come to fruition. And also, the center is employing UALR students now that sort of go to work in that field. So that just like full cycle, it's great and wonderful to see that happen and be able to be a part of that. The other is more at the local level, and we were able to, again, probably about 20 years ago, create what's called the University District, which is a program that works around the university's campus with the neighborhoods that exist here. We work on things like food insecurity. We build houses, so we're working on affordable housing, but really to try to work with the neighborhood folks at the very grassroots level of government relations to help them have their voice with the city of Little Rock and other officials so that problems that occur in our neighborhood are being addressed. So both the University District and the Nano Center sort of kind of are good bookends for success stories that I feel like I've been able to work on and help achieve for the university.
I had no idea that your job had anything to do with both of those things, which I did know about, and I think are sometimes unsung stories that the
Sure.
university has that we
Mhm.
don't hear about, even as faculty here. So
Right, right.
thank you for sharing those.
Yeah, I was surprised, obviously, to hear both of those. Growing bone, wow, what a concept. It reminds me, we actually had another UA Little Rock professor on a while back who's kind of an international expert in internet-based social media information, that sort of
Dr.
thing.
Agarwal.
That's it.
Mhm.
And that's another example, I think, of what most people don't even know what UA Little Rock does. So you do some impressive work there. So I appreciate hearing that from you.
Yeah, it's fun to be part of that.
I bet. So you're a chief government relations officer. You've been doing this a number of years. So I wonder, A lot has changed over the years. There's always change, but in Arkansas, we've had major political changes. So I wonder what has happened in terms of your role, how it has changed over the period of time you've been working on things.
Sure. And, I think it was around 2010, if you've watched that, progress in Arkansas, we went from having, I think, all Democrats in office at the congressional level, I think one Republican, to then now having all Republicans in our 4 congressional seats and our 2 Senate seats, and talk about, a sea change in the way that, a lot of the political topics have become discussed these days that, weren't at that point in time. So I think really to talk about the change in my role, you really do have to talk about the change in perspectives about higher education nationally, and that really has been seen here in the state as well. We have sometimes my colleagues at other campuses that do this work. There were times when we were like, we wish somebody would pay attention to us at the Capitol. Higher ed, sort of fell in line behind some of the other state priorities, and we didn't get as much discussion as we might have hoped. Now it's sort of like we don't like being in the limelight, but we are, because those cultural wars that we hear about and that we're, seeing in other states around us, those are here as well. And, the university campus has become somewhat of the battleground for a lot of that discussion. So we are working sort of, on the defensive now to some extent as higher ed professionals at the Capitol with a lot of issues that we see. And it's become a real difference in the way we've all started to approach our jobs and to build relationships when there's, a strong majority party in place now that does, maintain a good deal of power and influence in the legislature. So we really have to work, to find different ways to tell our story and to find ways to kind of reach consensus on issues in the legislature particularly.
Yeah, so what you're getting at, I think, is how nationally, because of culture wars, in some ways, the value that our society holds for higher education has decreased significantly in some quarters. Any idea of where that comes from? What might account for starting to kind of dismiss the value of higher education?
Yeah, again, I think it's some of the ideas that, there are concepts or theories, ideas that are being taught at, universities, or that process and policies we have in place that, some seem to some people to be maybe threatening to other ideas. So, you hear the term indoctrination a lot when it comes to higher ed and what people believe is going on campuses. And we have to battle that a lot. And I think it is to some extent when we've seen, access to higher education grow so much across the last couple of decades. And there's such a diverse population that are coming to campuses now. It probably at some point in time was a lot more homogenous in terms of, students that had access. So trying to work to be able to make sure that all of those, students from that diversity are nurtured and supported, that sometimes comes to be or look like the fact that we might be, tending to one a population's needs and not another. I believe that's where a lot of it comes from.
Yeah, it sounds like, in many ways, this reminds me of also what's happened with the press and media, kind of a greater sensitivity about things being taught or covered or mentioned that don't fit with some people's views. And I know in the past the argument has been that like on a college campus, you need to have a variety of views, including some that might be controversial, in order to eventually sort through everything and come to the truth.
Right. It seems like the idea that diverse viewpoints have become divisive viewpoints is really what we're talking about. And I think people are still trying to figure out how to work with that.
So higher ed funding over the years has also really decreased from the state levels. And I think there used to be a percentage people would talk about that, that the universities in general were funded like at a certain percentage. by the legislatures of states.
Mhm.
And that has changed considerably. Wondered if you could talk just a little bit about how you've seen that affect
Yeah.
even the work that you do.
Yeah, that is real. I think that for UALR specifically, I keep saying UALR because I've been here for so long. UA Literock specifically, the percentage I think of our state appropriations that funded the university, we got about 60%, 65% of our appropriation, to fund our operation, and that's down to about 42, I think, or maybe even closer to in the high 30 percent tally of what we are able to get from the state to help fund our operation. And that's caused a lot of pressure on finding other sources of revenue. And unfortunately, a lot of times what happens, as we know, as universities have faced that, they have had to raise tuition. And then we, get to a point where then the criticism is that, it's not affordable to come to our universities to get their degrees that students need. The pressure is on the family to come up with those resources to send students to college. And we like to kind of keep that balance so that that's not the case, but it's become a real, problem back at the Capitol, if you will, because we get criticism for that as well now. So one of the reasons that, I think that decrease has happened is there's so many other needs, of course, in state government. As we know, there has been also an appetite in several recent, years to see tax cuts at the state government level. And as you do that, you're decreasing revenue pools. So, it's that again, it's hard to balance all that. And I think it has become a real concern for most campuses to try to keep some of that in check. And do less with more. I mean, I will honestly say that that's what I know UA Literock tries to do and has done, and I think we can be pretty proud of some of the things that the university's been able to do. But we don't want to cause the it to be where our students are getting any kind of inferior experience while they're here because of those less decrease in resources. So I appreciate you bringing that up, because that is something probably that our government relation professionals for the universities, that's the key issue during our legislative session, is making sure that we maintain balance, and we try to keep what we have, and if at all possible, find other ways to get additional resources. But again, it's become a much more defensive posture these days than it was in the past.
Okay, thank you for that information.
So there may be some parallel things going on in your role. In fact, I feel sure they are, between what we do in Braver Angels in terms of reaching across political divisions and what you've experienced in your own work. So I wonder if you could tell us about at least one specific time when you had to reach across differences that may have been difficult in order to get something done. Tell us a little bit about what happened.
Yeah, I was having this kind of conversation with someone the other day that does this work as well. And, we were sort of trying to think about times that we don't have to do that now. And that may be the best way to answer your question, is for so much of what we are working on, especially at the state capitol, we feel like we are having to do that. We're having to sort of come up with different ways of telling the story. There is so much of, as we talked about a minute ago, just so much thought that the universities are, sort of perpetuating and teaching things that they feel that they don't want students to be exposed to. Um, and, we were asked questions about, why we have certain activities. Affirmative action has been, sort of under attack, if you will. And, how long has that been in place within state government and that, national federal programs? So we're having to figure out how to tell that story differently.
So it sounds like, if I'm understanding you right, you have much more of a skeptical audience in
Absolutely.
government than you once did. Is that right?
Yes, for
Yeah.
sure.
It's a shame, and I'm sure there are people who have their biases everywhere in every field, but I'm thinking of, at one point, higher education or education in general, having a diversity of ideas put forth was good. I'd mentioned that earlier about you can arrive at the truth. It's kind of like a marketplace of ideas and functions in a similar fashion to what the capitalist version of economics does. That if you have a lot of things out there competing, the best will come out, the lowest price will come out. Well, here, if you have a lot of ideas and people articulating them, then you come out with a closer approximation of the truth. And it sounds like that model is not appreciated or seen as legitimate anymore.
That is absolutely true. And I think April, would agree that, in higher education, we sort of hold, we hold that, kind of sacrosanct that, our role as universities is to make sure that all voices are heard, that, that conversations happen from those diverse viewpoints. That's how you learn. That's how students are able to, discern and, decide where their values lie and to, how they're going to take that into their career. I mean, there's nothing more important to that than that if you're a university, I believe. But yeah, that sort of has become sort of a question mark around all of that, how do we make that happen? And I don't like it. It's very concerning to me when I hear about any student, especially faculty as well, that, feel like that they are not able to voice their thoughts. That, I mean, I think it was a Pew research, survey last year, that, students are more and more feeling not able to voice their opinions in classrooms. That's not good for the educational process. That is not good at all. That's not the outcome that we're looking for. So that's quite concerning. And I think that we're all trying to figure out how we can still make that happen on our campuses, but in a way that we think is healthy and not, not dangerous, as we've seen it, be and come to be at, some universities. But at any rate, that's, that is something that it is interesting to think about how that has sort of become under fire, if you will, that process.
Mm-hmm. It's one of the things that I connect with an organization that's a group of scholars and faculty and staff from universities and high schools, I think as well, called Heterodox Academy. Jonathan Haidt started that
Yes.
originally, and they really are trying to emphasize how can we, as university personnel, work on allowing all voices to be heard, and allowing students to be able to feel like that they don't have to be afraid.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly there's a tension, right, between free speech and listening and respecting the voice of another who's different than you.
Right.
So it's difficult. I'm guessing in your conversations with higher ed professionals across the nation, as you've got this community, that you all have some common issues that you see divisive related to higher education, but that you also have hope for finding common ground or possibilities of finding common ground. And wondered if you see any of those or one or more that have potential for us working together across our divisions.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I guess I will have to bring up, and I mean, it's something you hear a lot about, but what's referred to as DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion is very much a catchphrase for a lot of what, has become to be the concern areas. I mean, we were all talking about that at the colleges and universities as a very positive set of programs and activities that we would be putting in place. And those have come to be labeled now as the places that some, folks on the side that feel that that's not what universities should be doing. I think that what those who are concerned about that type of activity view that as is that some students are given advantages, that scholarships or programs on the campus might be focused on, some racial population or LG, excuse me, LGBTQ populations or other minorities that, they believe that, why are you having programs that serve, just those students, or, are targeted towards those students. And, one of the ways we've really tried to change some of that narrative and keep trying to change that is, especially for UA Little Rock, is that, if we don't necessarily think about that as, that we're doing that, to sort of talk about diversity, if you will, but more about trying to find where each student is, where they're coming into their educational process, what obstacles are in their way, what things do maybe they need to overcome. You see a lot with first generation students, they've never had a support structure to help them, navigate college life and what that looks like. And I think we really kind of take the terminology of social and economic mobility to make sure that, we're going to work with every student to try to make sure that they can be successful. And the support systems we put up are not put up to try to, give an advantage to one group or another, but more so to help each student find the best way that they can be successful. And that's really what we do. That's the reality of some of those programs that are under attack, is to try to figure out how to make those successful pathways for each student. And we've tried to, take that narrative into the Capitol, and use that to talk with legislators about what we do. And it does help some, because everybody wants the students from their area to be successful. They want to see their students going to graduate and going to college and finding their career path. So that's a way that we, I guess, as an example of how we sort of try to keep the conversation going, to be able to talk about those things and not just stop when you hear the labels, and say, well, we're not doing that. You have to break that conversation down.
Interesting and significant point, changing the narrative, changing the language, focusing on common values that we might have with the other person. And I think about that as strategy for relationship building, but it's also a strategy for building coalitions that are supportive of higher education, inside and outside of government. I'm curious about, so I'm going to ask this question two different ways. One is going to be about relationships and with individual, maybe legislators, that, something that you have found to be effective in building that kind of relationship, and even the opportunity to talk about and change the narrative. So I'd like for you to talk about that first, and then I'll ask more about coalitions in general.
I think you can think about it in terms of, I mean, the legislature, for example, only meets, certain months of the year. And then during the interim session, we have a lot of committee meetings. We have a lot of events and activities where we're able to spend more time with legislators individually. And those are really key, because you can get in the heat of a legislative session. And, if what you're wanting to say to a legislator is not on a post-it note, you sort of kind of have to figure out how to get your point across. So making sure that you've developed and built those relationships, so that when a legislator sees you coming, they sort of know where you already are, or what your position is on certain things, what you're going to say about what the university, feels is important. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it was you can easily, just sort of stand back and just look at the other side, if you will, and say, well, they're going to say this, or they're going to, do this. I think it's Brene Brown, that says it's hard to hate, close up, lean into those relationships and those conversations. It's hard, because a lot of those they do start out, confrontational, but over time, building those relationships with key legislators, you get into session and tempers flare, and you sort of have to make sure that, your demeanor remains sort of calm and, sort of consistent. And hopefully, if you build those relationships, over the long term, that will sort of, carry you through some of those hard, discussions you have to have.
Any keys for building those relationships?
Yeah, so while you were talking about, and what I just said, too, I mean, that you get to know folks, you get to know where their position is, you get to try to appreciate that even. Um, and I will have to say, I mean, we all at the higher ed level, we get, government relations folks, that's part of our job we get paid to do. It's great to get alumni and business people, other community leaders that we know that can talk to legislators or other officials on our behalf, because those could be their neighbors or people they sit in a church pew with, or people that, their kids play soccer together. And that's a different perspective they can hear from, and they can hear, this is what, I think will happen with that legislation. I know the university's telling you, this, but let me tell you sort of specifically how that could impact me or a student. And so those are really important. I mean, I think the more perspectives that a legislator can hear about, from that, just helps them, know more about what could be the ripple effect of a bill or something. And so, and really having that conversation become, what is of value? How do we value the university? What does it do that's important? It helps people find jobs. It helps the state's economy. It helps, find solutions to big, problems that the communities have. So the more they hear that story and know those relationships and build those, coalitions, the better, chance we're going to have of trying to be successful.
Interesting, because when I was thinking about the coalition part of this question, which you just answered, I was thinking more about coalitions within the legislature itself,
Oh,
right?
okay.
So
Yeah.
that you're actually building, kind of groups of people that would be supportive of a bill, which does
Sure.
happen. People,
Sure.
the legislators do that. But that kind of coalition is also part of your job, is to find what's happening in the local communities that people can really be a part of and help you actually tell the story. I think
That's right.
that's interesting. Thank you
Yeah.
for sharing that.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, you're talking about values, and that kind of segues pretty nicely into what I was wanting to ask you about. April has heard this kind of question from me before, because it's one of those things that I kind of think about a lot. It seems an important consideration to me, and that is the conflict between tribally based power positions and considerations based on values. So, what I mean by that is that it's my perception, at least, and I think a lot of people's, that these days, as we've become increasingly polarized, political conflicts are and positions are based more on tribal considerations than based on values. And so that as a result, sometimes politicians or parties may actually have a set of values that they've articulated and then later act inconsistent with those values because it suits the tribe they're with. Now, here
Right.
comes the hard part of the question, which is knowing that to do this would possibly diminish one's power if you go against your tribe. How do we move people from the tribal considerations to more values-based behavior when we deal with an issue?
Right. Yeah, that's such a valid and good point. And it's very true. And you sort of looked up one day and was like, oh, how did we get here? I don't think, I consider my political, sort of set of values. I didn't derive that from the party that, I feel like I belong to. In fact, you sort of have looked at that and said, okay, where do I go find the place to where, that party may represent more of what I think about, but it's not my identity. And that has really been flipped on its head a lot. And we definitely are experiencing, I think as a country, the fact that there is a real, sort of, a hesitance to cross the picket line, so to speak, and take yourself out of your political party. And I'm just going to use that for the interchangeably with your tribe word, because that is true. I have had legislators, or we have had legislators say to us, hey, I'm not saying that I necessarily, think this is the right thing. And specifically, I can give you an example. We were working on some legislation a couple of sessions back about having guns on campus and allowing, folks to carry guns into university classrooms and all that. And as you can imagine, that was a big concern for the universities. And we were working with legislators about that, and specifically had a legislator, tell me that, look, I don't necessarily think that it's good. I don't think it's really good, for there to be the presence of guns on, a campus. But my rating with the, gun lobby will be rated down if I don't vote this way. And so I'm sorry, but that's what I'm going to have to do. And we see that in a lot of other places where, you're able to, sort of going into the conversation that that's going to be a hard thing for a legislator to think about. And I guess to kind of answer your question on like maybe some ways to do that is, it's, I guess we've all sort of heard, in different disciplines, there's this bell curve idea that, there's 15% of the people that are totally against you. You're not going to sway them. Forget about doing something to get them to, to where you are. Then there's the 15% that are already with you. Don't worry about trying to, convince them. It's that group in the middle. And I'm not sure if it's 15, 70, 15, but whatever that group in the middle looks like, that's your opportunity. That's where you go and you try to find, individuals that will engage in conversation, will think about that. You actually think, well, maybe we could, talk with them about amending that piece of legislation or something, because we think they might, actually, this will resonate with them when we talk with them about the possibility that, what we think their party is going to vote for, this might be something that we could talk about. And that's really, I think, how we approach it. And, we kind of deal with that on a, bill by bill basis with legislators, specifically if you're talking about the, kind of legislative process.
Well, in that case, it was pretty easy because he or she told you their dilemma. That's often not the case. So how can you differentiate between those people who are operating in good faith from a values-based consideration to those who seem motivated only by power?
Right. And, that's a good point too, is, I mean, you really have to recognize and acknowledge and even respect the power piece of this conversation, because I mean, we've all heard, after November 7th, we all heard and have been hearing, we just all have to sit down at the table. We've all got to come back to the table and discuss things and, get over our differences sort of approach. That narrative assumes that everybody wants to come to the table and that everybody's ready to negotiate or find compromise. And, honestly, that's not the case. I mean, and I'm saying that on both sides of the aisle. I think it's quite true that individuals both from, if we're going to say liberal and conservative, just sort of to name those polar areas. I mean, if we want to have a conversation, but we don't really want to think about, well, maybe I should consider, changing where I'm standing in that conversation. That's not real dialogue. That's not real, that's just throwing words at each other. So, we have to look for those folks. And again, I mean, I could, name individuals that, aren't going to be willing to give up any of that power that they have, and understandably so. That's where things sit right now. So, it's just a constant, sort of process of just continuing to go back in and try to find a way to have a conversation. But I think acknowledging that all the time that folks involved are not willing to change their position, we have to be honest about that, and we have to be realistic about that.
Not everybody wants to sit down at the table. That's a significant point that I forget sometimes to mention when I teach the class that I was teaching this fall called Listening and Civil Dialogue. There's an assumption that when we talk about good listening behaviors, that people really are operating in good faith. And I would love to believe that in general, to come to every conversation with a perspective of trust, a trust that they are entering the conversation with goodwill. And I think if I don't do that, then I get so cynical that I'm not going to actually be able to have conversations or be willing to. Thanks for joining us on today's edition of On the Other Hand, the first part of our conversation with Joni Lee today. Hope that you will listen to other conversations or contact us via our website, which you can find on the podcast page of the Braver Angels Arkansas website, and that's at arkansas.braverangels.org or on many popular podcast sites.
And if you enjoyed hearing from Joni, then you might consider listening to our conversation with David Childs. David is the state co-coordinator for Braver Angels in Arkansas, and he's on episodes 20 and 21.
On the Other Hand is sponsored by Braver Angels in Arkansas. Music was composed by Randall Standridge of Jonesboro, Arkansas, and was performed by the University of Northern Colorado Symphonic Band, Dr. Richard Main, conductor.
From your host, Glen White,
and April Chatham Carpenter,
let's each do our part to bring our community closer together.